Hello, P Street family, and whoever else might be joining us this evening, or maybe you're going to take the time to watch this at a later date. All are welcome. And we've been talking about what I've called postcards from heaven. So what we've been thinking through are the one chapter books of the Bible. So in the Old Testament, there is Obadiah. Then you move to the New Testament. We looked at Philemon. Last week we looked at 2 John. And then tonight we want to think about 3 John. Now, contrary to what I believe I said last week, 3 John is actually the smallest book of the Bible. Okay? It beats 2 John by about 25 Greek words. Both of the letters, though, would have fit on a single piece of papyrus, a papyrus sheet. So they're both pretty small. 3 John, like Philemon, is a personal letter. It is written to a man named Gaius. There's debate about whether or not 2 John is a personal letter to an elect lady, whether it's referring to an actual lady or whether it's referring to a congregation. But unlike Philemon, 3 John is a private letter. Okay, Philemon seemed to have a bit of a wider audience in view. 3 John seems to be very much private. Here is some orienting data. Let me get that out. An orientation to 3 John. I think it's helpful to kind of get the big picture overview before you get into the details. So if I bring that up here, you'll see that the author refers to himself as the elder. That's what we saw in 2 John. There's no reason to seriously question the Apostle John as the author. The language is similar to 2 John. 2 John is extremely similar to 1 John in many points. They all seem to be written by the same guy. Referring to himself as the elder has certainly raised questions about why he does so. It points to his age, I'm sure, at this point in time, but also to his authority. He evidently knew that those to whom he was writing would identify him by this designation, the elder. You'll see that the recipient is Gaius. 3 John 1, the elder to the beloved Gaius. He is a friend of John. We could, on the basis of verse 4, we'll see that in a moment, we could conclude that Gaius was a convert of John's. You'll see the date. The date is the 90s, somewhere in there, the last decade of the first century. It seems best to conclude that 3 John does come after 1 and 2 John and does come after the Gospel of John. As far as the origin of this letter, from where it was written, Ephesus seems the best guess for that, given the strong testimony that that's where the Apostle John spent the latter part of his life working from. So Ephesus is in Asia Minor. And naturally, most folks think that the people to whom he's writing, or the churches to whom he's writing in the case of 2 John, were located in Asia Minor somewhere. And then if you're looking at the content, we know that in 2 John, John was urging his recipients not to show hospitality to false teachers. But in 3 John, as you can see here, under content. In 3 John, John underscores the obligations of Christian hospitality toward approved itinerant ministers, toward true teachers. That, 2 John's like, hey, you don't need to receive those who are false teachers. 3 John is, hey, you need to receive those who are true teachers. It does appear that an earlier letter to the church, of which Gaius was a member, or We'll look at this a little more, but there does appear to have been an earlier letter written to a church that Gaius and Diotrephes both could have been members, or maybe just Diotrephes himself, but it is a letter that had been scorned by Diotrephes, who also refused hospitality to the elders or to John's friends. And Diotrephes even went so far as to disfellowship those who were planning to show hospitality or who desired to show hospitality towards John's friends. So John consequently writes 3 John, what we know as 3 John, to Gaius, urging him, among other things, to welcome a man named Demetrius. Here is perhaps a clever way to summarize 3 John. This was written by A.M. Hunter. 3 John is all about the elder who wrote it, Gaius who received it, Diotrephes who provoked it, and Demetrius who carried it. So you can see that there are at least 3 names that stand out here. And in just a moment, our outline will reflect that. Our outline of 3 John will take advantage of those 3 names. But before we get into the outline, I want us to think some about hospitality in the first century. And it serves as a background to 3 John and at least to a couple of verses back in 2 John. But what we have going on in 3 John and in 2 John can be somewhat strange to those of us living in North American culture. I mean, today, ministers, evangelists, preachers are usually invited to a congregation to speak for either one time or a series of lessons like in a gospel meeting or some seminar, and that hosting church, that inviting church will put that individual up in a motel or hotel. In some cases, they might stay with a family or something like that. In the first century, hospitality towards strangers was considered a virtue. I mean, that goes way back into like Genesis 18. And accommodations were often linked to the temple or to the synagogue, at least among Jews. And this practice of entertaining strangers became a big part of early Christianity because you had these people that were making their way throughout the known world preaching the gospel. And they weren't maybe so much invited to a locality or to a particular church. They're just bringing about the Great Commission, right? They're honoring that. And as they're going throughout the known world, they had an opportunity to receive hospitality from various Christian households and churches. I mean, this fact of hospitality runs throughout the New Testament. You can find it in Jesus sending out the 12 and the 72. It's mentioned by Paul as an expression of love in Romans 12:13. It's urged as a form of Christian conduct in Hebrews 13:2. That's where we read, "Do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers, for thereby some have entertained angels unawares." And that takes us back to Genesis 18, in fact. And there's 1 Peter 4, verse 9. "Show hospitality to one another without grumbling." And by the very nature of things, elders were expected to be hospitable people, 1 Timothy 3:2. And true widows, or widows indeed, were those who had shown hospitality and washed the feet of the saints, 1 Timothy 5 and verse 10. So this sort of provides our background. We get sort of a picture in 3 John of how things sort of work themselves out in the spread of the gospel, in missionary activity, and the help that these itinerant ministers and missionaries hoped or expected to get along the way from Christian communities as they as they traveled throughout the known world. There does seem to be evidence here and elsewhere that teachers, preachers needed to bring a letter of commendation, and it's quite possible that 3 John serves as a letter of commendation for a man named Demetrius. That maybe somebody known to the church or to that area would vouch for a particular individual, say, hey, he's good, he's a true teacher, he is a gospel preacher, he says the truth and he lives the truth. Because again, going back to 2 John, there were folks out there that weren't about the truth. They were about error. They were about spreading lies. They were about spreading falsehoods and things, even about the nature of Jesus Christ, some very fundamental things. They would go and spread their heresy, as it were. And John and 2 John said, hey, we can't be about helping those folks. We certainly can't be propagating or helping them propagate their error, because then we share in their wicked work. 3 John is the opposite of that, as we've mentioned. Okay, so that provides you a bit of a background. This hospitality, it was sort of a cultural phenomenon that's crucial to our understanding of 3 John. Now with that, we're going to move to think about our outline and just work through it. Again, the letter's not real long, but so let's take the time as we've got it to just read through it, make some comments along the way, and then we'll end with a question that I think is it penetrates to the heart of a person. And it's something that I think will challenge you, maybe in more ways than one. But so verses 1 through 8, we can refer to this as the confirmation of Gaius. Okay, this is again to whom John is writing the letter. So we come with the salutation, and then we'll take a moment to look at the salutation. The elder to the beloved Gaius, whom I love in truth. Gaius was a very common Roman name. There are actually 3 other Gaiuses in the New Testament. There is Gaius of Macedonia, mentioned in Acts 19:29. There's Gaius of Derbe, mentioned in Acts 20 and verse 4. And then there's Gaius of Corinth, who seems to be mentioned in both Romans 16:23 and 1 Corinthians 1 and 14. And we really have no reason to associate this Gaius in 3 John with any of those others. Again, the name was common, kind of like Mary. There's evidence that Lazarus was a fairly common name. So all that we can know about this Gaius, I think, comes to us from the letter of 3 John. Now, from the way that Gaius is addressed, it may be assumed that he was a leading member of the congregation to which he belonged. Beloved here is translated in other standard translations as dear friend. And you will see, if you've got 3 John in front of you, which I probably should have told you to get 3 John in front of you when we started this, but you will see that verse 1, verse 2, verse 5, verse 11, okay, all use the term of endearment beloved in reference to Gaius. And then notice whom I love in truth. We saw this last week with 2 John. John could be saying whom I truly love, whom I love in truth, whom I truly love. Or I think better is to think of it in terms of whom I love because of our common bond in the truth and gospel of Jesus Christ. John loves Gaius in connection with the truth because between them such a basis exists. Okay. Next is the godliness of Gaius in verses 2 through 4. So here we read, beloved, there it is again, reference to Gaius, or dear friend, I pray that all may go well with you and that you may be in good health as it goes well with your soul. In other words, John is praying, and this is the point we're going to come back to at the very end. John is praying that Gaius's physical health, and maybe that idea may go well with you, might even be looking at his financial prosperity, his financial health, that those things would match his spiritual health. In other words, that Gaius would be as well off physically and potentially financially as he is spiritually. And not a few writers will note here that how one's soul is doing ought to be the rule by which he or she judges prosperity and wealth and health, not the other way around. We're going to come back to that point. There's something extremely challenging in verse 2. Verse 3, "For I rejoiced greatly when the brothers came and testified to your truth, as indeed you are walking in the truth. I have no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth." Now, notice the emphasis on truth in verses 3 and 4. And then, start of verse 3, the word "for" there, okay, this is where John is supplying the evidence as to how he knows that Gaius is doing well spiritually. He knows that Gaius is spiritually healthy because of the news which the brothers brought to him, that some of the brethren had brought to him. John's greatest joy was learning that his children, there in verse 4, that might imply, when he says that I have, no greater joy than to hear that my children are walking in the truth, that could very well be a reference to the fact, and it might imply that Gaius was a convert of John. And of all the things that he might hear about his converts, nothing brought him greater joy than to know that they were remaining loyal to the truth. John Stott, he comments, he says, "Whoever walks in the truth is an integrated believer in whom there is no dichotomy between profession and practice." A preacher delights to know that those whom he has converted have continued in what they were taught. And I can testify that myself. It hurts when you learn of somebody that you've had a spiritual impact on the past has left or fallen away. And then it brings joy when you learn that they are still going. They haven't fallen. They're still putting one foot in front of the other. That's a huge encouragement to preachers like myself. And so notice again, though, John is really establishing here Gaius's loyalty to the truth and the fact that he is living in accordance with the truth. Now, moving from the discussion of his godliness, then we get into a discussion of Gaius's generosity or hospitality. Okay? So here we go. 3 John 5 through 8. "Beloved," again, the term of endearment, "it is a faithful thing you do in all your efforts for these brothers, strangers as they are, who testified to your love before the church. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God. For they have gone out for the sake of the name, accepting nothing from the Gentiles. Therefore, we ought to support people like these, that we may be fellow workers for the truth." So Gaius had established a reputation among the churches for practicing hospitality, which, as we highlighted earlier, is frequently urged upon Christians in the New Testament. Gaius welcomed traveling teachers and preachers, and he supported them on their onward journey. And those who had benefited from his service had testified to Gaius's fidelity in this matter. I'll bring it up in maybe a little smaller. You could still probably make some of that out as I make some comments. It does seem as if there in the second part of verse 6 that John is thinking in terms of future occasions on which such hospitality and generosity for the missionaries would be needed. You will do well to send them on their journey in a manner worthy of God. The Greek verb translated send them on their journey is often used in the context of hospitality and can refer to various kinds of support. Perhaps they need food. Perhaps they need money. Maybe they need some travel companions, or they need means of travel. Whatever it is that you could do to kind of help them along the way. And it seems we get here an indication of how things worked in the first century. You can imagine that, like in the instance of Paul and Barnabas, they were sent out on their missionary journey. You could see churches sending out folks on a missionary journey, giving them enough provisions to get to their maybe first or second destination, and then the hope was once they get there, they would find a community of Christians who could then supply them with their needs and help them get on to the next leg of their journey as they are out and about on their missionary exploits. And the expectation was that the churches already established along the way would receive such men, take care of their needs among them, and send them on with provisions for their upcoming trip. That seems to be what is going on here in this section. Verse 7 provides a couple of reasons that the brethren who were going forth to preach the gospel deserved the support that John had mentioned. One, they had gone out for the sake of the name Jesus Christ. That's the name. No question about it. They had gone out. That language is used in 2 John for the false teachers. They had gone out to spread their lies, right, and their heresy. These guys, these true teachers, they had gone out to preach the gospel and to spread the truth. So the one reason they needed support was that. The second was they refused to accept any support from the Gentiles. And that is more descriptive than prescriptive. This verse 7 does raise a question that some folks have had about whether or not Christians should accept help from outsiders or from unbelievers or things of that nature. As a rule, God's work should be supported by God's people. And generally, that's what the norm is going to be. But here's the other thing: there are times when non-Christians or unbelievers may want to help in some way. Maybe they don't fully understand what's involved. Maybe they just know enough to know, hey, these people seem to be trying to do some good things. I want to help them. I mean, there are morally good people out in the world who may not share our convictions and who do not understand or fully appreciate the gospel when they need to. And it might offend somebody like that to refuse their gift. Here's what I'd say. I don't think money or support should be sought from unbelievers, but neither should it be rejected unless, of course, there are strings attached to the support that they are giving. I think under no condition should spiritual or other favors be bought by anyone. Again, this passage is simply noting that these traveling preachers, missionaries, did not accept help from unbelievers. And many times that was to refrain from any appearance of trying to sell the truth. Paul had to deal with that a lot in his ministry in defending himself. He often wouldn't even really accept help from the churches themselves that he was seeking to establish or to further in the faith, because he didn't want to be tagged as being a huckster or charlatan or something like that. So there's some things to consider with verse 7. I think we need to have some balance on that. Generally speaking, unbelievers are not going to help believers on their way. It's going to take the church, it's going to take believers to fund and to support missionary activity in this world. And so, verse 8, it's the obligation of other Christians to support these folks. And in supporting them, such hospitable and generous Christians become, according to what John says here, fellow workers in the truth or for the truth. Those who support the preacher who preaches the truth are fellow workers in the truth. And I think about Romans 10 and verse 14. The preacher cannot preach unless he is sent. In 2 John, think of a contrast here. In 2 John, to receive a false teacher is to share in his wicked work. In 3 John, to receive a true teacher is to be a fellow worker for the truth. As we move to the next part of the outline, we have the condemnation of Diotrephes. So what's interesting is Diotrephes, that name is as rare as Gaius's name is common. And a lot of people want to know, well, what does that name mean? Well, it means something along the lines of Zeus reared, or a nursling of Zeus, leaving many people to think that this was the name of someone in a sort of high-class Greek family or Roman family even. It's hard to say what Diotrephes' background is. I think we can say he is a Christian, albeit one that needs to check himself and needs to make some changes and certainly needs to repent. But Diotrephes serves as a negative example for the kind of leadership and disposition that we should find among God's people. So if we bring up 3 John 9 and 10, we read, I have written something to the church. Now, evidently, John had previously instructed the church along the line of hospitality. I do not think that this is a reference to 2 John. This is potentially a letter that, and more than likely a letter that we do not have. And that was, to put it simply, never, intended for the New Testament canon. And the church here may be a reference to the church of which both Gaius and Diotrephes were members. Others think that they were members of different congregations in the same vicinity or the same locality, a couple of different house churches or something like that. That's hard to establish either way. But here's what John is writing. John is writing to Gaius, and he's got a talking point here about Diotrephes. Notice, I've written something to the church, but Diotrephes, who likes to put himself first, does not acknowledge our authority. So if I come, I will bring up what he is doing, talking wicked nonsense against us, and not content with that. He refuses to welcome the brothers and also stops those who wants to and puts them out of the church. There has been some discussion about whether or not Diotrephes was trying to prevent these true teachers because he himself held to false teaching. There's no indication that that's the case. What we can glean from this is that Diotrephes had a problem with pride. That, notice, who likes to put himself first, John writes, or some of the older translations have, who loveth to have preeminence. This guy had a real high opinion of himself. And he certainly seemed to have sort of a top-down mentality when it comes to leadership rather than a bottom-up. And notice the kinds of stuff he is guilty of here. He is not acknowledging the authority of the elder, who we have argued is the Apostle John. Okay? The apostles functioned in a unique capacity in the first century. We do not have such apostles today. We do have the writings, and we do submit to the authority inherent in these writings, being ultimately, right, breathed out by God through the operation or work of the Holy Spirit. But this Diotrephes is not acknowledging the authority of John. He's talking wicked nonsense, which seems to imply that he is, he's coming up with some false charges. He's slandering John, all of which is nonsense. But he's looking to knock John down several steps in the minds of Diotrephes' circle of influence. And John says, I'm going, if I come, I'm going to talk with Diotrephes. But Diotrephes he wasn't just content with dismissing the authority of John and talking trash. He decides that he is going to refuse to welcome the brothers. Evidently, John had some true teachers, some gospel preachers coming through. Diotrephes refused to be hospitable. That's a problem, certainly in light of what we just read in verses 5 through 8. And then he even goes further than that, because you had folks in the congregation who recognized their responsibility, both in love and to the truth, to provide hospitality to these brothers. And Diotrephes, he wouldn't allow it. In fact, he stops them and even goes so far as to essentially excommunicate them or to put them out of the church. And this is the extent of what we know about Diotrephes. And it's not good. And John fully intends to confront Diotrephes when he has an opportunity. But notice, he's writing to Gaius, and he's providing Gaius here with, in essence, a negative example. Gaius, this isn't how you are, and this is how I hope you never become. Right? In fact, when we go to the next movement in this letter, we have a commendation of Demetrius. Now, we could have sandwiched another one like counsel for Gaius or something in between these two, but I just went ahead and put verses 11 and 12 together. You'll notice verse 11 starts with beloved, which is the way that John refers to Gaius. That's what he's done throughout this letter. And notice what he says. He goes, hey, do not imitate evil, but imitate good. Don't be like Diotrephes, right? Don't be like that guy. And then he says, whoever does good is from God. Whoever does evil has not seen God. A Christian who belongs to God's family must not act as though he belonged to another group. Actions which are contrary to the spirit and manner of God endangers fellowship with God by destroying its basis. So I see here counsel for Gaius. He slips this in here saying, hey, don't be like Diotrephes, okay? In other words, you keep doing what you are doing. And then verse 12, we meet Demetrius. Demetrius has received a good testimony. So like Gaius, Demetrius is one who imitates good. He is one who does good. And John here is going to commend Demetrius, who seems to be under John's sponsorship. Demetrius has received a good testimony, and this testimony comes as sort of threefold here. One, testimony from everyone, okay? His reputation among the churches where he was well known was good. From the truth itself. The revealed truth, as it is realized in Christian living, speaks for the one who is practicing that truth, because such living becomes a matter for all to see. And then we also, John says here, we add our testimony. And you'll notice that John uses sort of a plural, first person plural. Some have identified that as the plural of authority, but he's adding his own testimony. And he says here, you know that our testimony is true. And that is another indication, however subtle, that John is the one that's writing. And I say that because that idea of our testimony, you know our testimony is true. Go back to the Gospel of John. Look in John 18, John 21. Or John 19, I should say, and John 21. That kind of language is used by John. And by the way, John was kind of discreet. He didn't like to refer to himself as John. He would often refer to himself as the disciple whom Jesus loved. That's in the Gospel of John, and then in 2 John and 3 John, he refers to himself as the elder. But it appears that Demetrius is one of the traveling preachers of the gospel whom the elder wanted Gaius to be hospitable towards. That he wanted Gaius to take care of him and to entertain him, as it were. And it's quite likely that Demetrius was the bearer of this letter. This letter sort of served as a commendation letter for him to let Gaius know, and those over whom Gaius had any influence, that this guy, we can vouch for him, and he is deserving of your hospitality and your blessing. So, with that, we come to the conclusion, and verses 13 through 14. And 3 John ends in much the same way that 2 John ends. So here we read, I had much to write to you, but I would rather not write with pen and ink. I hope to see you soon, and we will talk face to face. Peace be to you. The friends greet you, greet the friends, each by name. So it ends with that call for sort of reciprocal greetings. The friends here greet you, Gaius, and I want you to convey our greetings to each of your friends that are, in fact, our friends. Peace be to you is interesting because that is reminiscent of Jesus' greeting after his resurrection. Go back and read the Gospel of John. Whenever Jesus came to them after he's been dead, buried, and resurrected, he would come in their midst, no doubt would have been a startling thing, and he would say something along the lines of, peace be to you. Now, whether or not John has that in mind while he is writing this, peace be to you, possibly not. But it is a neat connection to make between 3 John and then the resurrection words of Jesus, his resurrection greetings, as it were, to his own disciples. All right, so that's a walk through the letter. We've met a guy named Gaius, a guy named Diotrephes, and a guy named Demetrius. And I want to close by asking this question, which takes us back to 3 John 2 to verse 2. If your physical health reflected your spiritual health, what would you look like? If I might paraphrase verse 2 of 3 John, John says to Gaius, may you be as healthy physically and financially as you are spiritually. Now, how many of us, let's be honest, how many of us would be comfortable with such a prayer on our behalf? What would you look like if your physical health was a reflection of your spiritual health? Would your physical health change for the better or for the worse? There's some people out here that are physical specimens. They really take care of their body, but they couldn't be more rotten on the inside. And vice versa, you have some people who are sickly, that have a body that's diseased, that's racked by pain, some of which, a lot of which they didn't have any control over, perhaps, and but yet spiritually, they could not be stronger. So if your physical health was a reflection of your spiritual health, what would you look like? Would you be a ripped physical specimen, fit for the Olympics? Or would you be a gaunt, lifeless shell of a human being that's fit for the grave? If your physical health was a reflection of your spiritual health, what would you look like? And you could ask the same thing about your finances. Would you be a prince or a pauper? John's prayer of Gaius is complimentary. He had evidence that Gaius was spiritually healthy. He does testify to that. He had received a report along those lines. Seems to me that had Gaius not been a spiritually healthy man, John would have never uttered such a prayer. So what about you? Are you spiritually healthy? And if you were to say, hey, I'm picturing in my mind what I would look like if my physical health were a reflection of my spiritual health, and I can't say that I like what I'm picturing, you got some changes, right, that you need to make. There's some repentance that needs to be done. There is some coming home that needs to happen. And I'm always here, right, at any point to be of help to you, to pray with you, to counsel you, to study with you, to challenge you if need be. But I think that's a really good question to end on 3 John. Next week, we're going to look at one more postcard from heaven, and that will be the book of Jude. And Jude is loaded. There is a lot there to consider, and so I'm going to have to streamline our study of that more so than I've had to do with 2nd and 3rd John. But I invite you back next week as we think about one more postcard from heaven. Thanks for taking the time to watch this and listen to this. May God bless you.